Hello. Today we're going to talk about Zionism, and we're going to do so by doing a little bit of a reading in Israel, The Two Halves of the Nation by Amnon Katz, who was my father. And actually, I think this is a nice follow-up to a different live stream that I did on a different channel about the early settlement of Louisiana by the French. And in that reading, we found out that the French tried to simply send a lot of deported people to Louisiana at one point, thinking that they could take, say, a salt smuggler or a libertine and turn him into a laborer or a farmer. And that didn't work because even unskilled labor requires some preparation, and not everybody can simply be taken out of wherever he is and sent someplace else and end up being either a good slave or a good laborer or a good farmer. And so now let's talk about something that happened a little bit later. This was in the 1700s. What we're going to be talking about is the 19th century and the inception of Zionism. And I've got something funny to tell you. On the live stream that Julia and I did, in which we were discussing bullying and the Holocaust as a form of bullying, we had one comment on our live chat by someone who had never heard of Zionism, or if he'd heard of it, he thought it was just a bad term. So he thought it was maybe like the elders of Zion, just something that you said when you didn't like Jews. So actually, Zionists and Jews are not always good friends. They have not always been good friends. And there is a conflict, and we'll talk about that conflict. But first, a word from our sponsor. Now, first I have to somehow try to figure out how to share this on Twitter, since certain people are unaware that YouTube exists. And so they just go to Twitter and they press T, and that's the only way they know how to get to my channel. And if it doesn't appear on Twitter, they just don't show up here. So on the other hand, YouTube has decided to make it really hard to share on Twitter in the middle of a live stream. So I'm going to try to do this here by turning around, and there we go. Just keep looking at that. So don't go away. We're about to talk about Zionism. Here we are. I'm back. I have my glasses. They're over here. I'm putting them down on Theodosia and the Pirates. So if I ask you, where are my glasses, you can shout out and let me know that they are on the table and they're on Theodosia and the Pirates. So this is chapter 1. And This is what the book looks like. There's a picture here of Ze'ev Jabotinsky, Avraham Edelson, and Shlomo Gepstein here. But anyway, chapter 1 has a synopsis. And since we're probably not going to get around to reading all of it, let me read you the synopsis. Well, first of all, it has a title. And the title of chapter 1 is Emergence of Modern Israel. And then the synopsis says, negative motivation has been part of Zionism since its inception. A lot of people think that negative motivation is bad, but there you have it. Anti-Semitism in Europe, culminating in bloody pogroms in Russia, drove reinforcements to the struggling Hebrew settlement in Palestine. But as the drama unfolded, the participants found a host of positive motives. The new Palestinian community rediscovered some of the traits required for sovereignty: control of land, mastery of agriculture, a full spectrum of occupations and skills, spreading of population, armed militancy. Each of these was a step away from the tradition of the Jewish communities from which their parents originated. And with each step grew the gulf between the new Israeli and his cousin, the intellectual, service-oriented, urban, pacifistic, traditional Jew. The unreligious nature of the Hebrew settlement is stressed, and the role of the religious minority within it described. Against all precedent, the new community revived the ancient language of the land and identified with it. With immigration restricted, a new culture bloomed, sheltered from outside influences. It molded a unique spirit that was put to demanding tests and passed. We took on the British Empire to claim sovereignty and won. We withstood the onslaught of 5 Arab countries and held it and broke it. Okay, so now section 1, political Zionism and practical Zionism. Zionism officially reveres Theodor Herzl as its founder. A fully assimilated Austrian of Jewish descent, Herzl was born in Budapest in 1860. And you might think, what is he doing in Budapest? Well, Austro-Hungarian Empire. Okay. In 1894, young Herzl was a foreign correspondent in Paris representing the Viennese New Free Press, the Neue Freie Presse. The news of the day was the Dreyfus Trial. Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a well-assimilated Frenchman of Jewish descent, was being accused of treason. Dreyfus was convicted, stripped of his rank, and shipped off to prison on Devil's Island. France eventually recovered from its blunder. Well, you know, they had a lot of blunders because there were all those salt smugglers that they liked to deport. So anyway, the trumped-up charges against Dreyfus were exposed, and following some ups and downs, he was fully cleared and reinstated in 1906. The arduous soul-searching triggered by the Dreyfus affair helped France define itself as a modern nation. The separation of church and state, instituted in France in 1905, was a spin-off. Herzl did not live to see all of this. He died in 1904. In any case, he did not feel like waiting. Anti-Semitism in France was real. Initially, so long as Dreyfus was presumed guilty, the forces of reason and justice, which eventually prevailed, remained silent. The effect on Herzl was immediate and irreversible. He concluded that Jews must live apart. By Jews, he meant individuals of Jewish descent. These people, Herzl held forth, needed their own country. By historical logic, that country should be Palestine. Herzl was not very particular about this point. In 1903, he was willing to settle for Uganda. Yeah, and in case you think that my father made that up, I actually have a volume here in my library, which is called the Uganda Controversy, Volume 1. I don't have Volume 2, but it's the minutes of the Zionist General Council. Okay, and here's a letter. Can you see how brown this envelope is? It's from the University of Tel Aviv to my grandmother, Gveret Clara Katz, Rehov Be'eri 42, Tel Aviv. And in it, you know, letters used to look like this. It's from the Tel Aviv University to my grandmother, and it says, Gveret Katz הנכבדה, בדור נפרד שלחנו לך שני ספרים שיצאו זה עתה מטעם המכון לחקר הציונות, והם. Okay, so it's Dear Mrs. Katz, in a separate mail, we sent you two, and by the way, why separate mail? Because it costs more to send one thing than the other. So if you sent books separately, you could send them less expensively. Two books that just now came out from the Institute for the Investigation of Zionism, and they are Eliav, Ahavat Zion V'Anshe Hod, and Hyman, The Minutes of the Zionist General Council, the Uganda Controversy. פרופסור בן ציון קץ המנוח יזם בזמנו את העבודות האלה המתפרסמות זה עתה, ואני משער שתשמחי לראות אותן מוכנות. It says the late Professor Ben Zion Katz was the one who instigated, or it was his idea that this work be done, that these books come out, and I imagine that you will be happy to see that these books are ready. So, in other words, my grandfather had a part in bringing forth this book about the Uganda controversy. Okay, back to my father's book. We're talking about how Palestine was the historical place where this country should be, but Herzl was very pragmatic. He thought Uganda would be just as good. In his original vision, the language of the Jewish country would be his own language, German. The Judenstaat would be a European community with mild socialist overtones. The only major principle served by its existence would be apartheid. One may wonder, and this is my father speaking, one may wonder how a lone visionary, totally unfamiliar with the community he aspired to lead, had any impact. So he didn't really like the Jews. So part of the answer is that he was rushing into an open door. The idea of reviving and reinstating the historical sovereignty of Israel was timely. The idea of it had already sprouted and taken root. The age of the Enlightenment had long been penetrating the Jewish communities of Europe. Different individuals responded differently. Some, like the families of Herzl and Dreyfus, assimilated. Others, too deeply attached to their Jewish roots, sought a Jewish enlightenment. Emergence of national entities seeking expression in separate national languages was one of the prominent features of the Enlightenment. And if you want to know more about that, you should definitely read my hub about national anthems. I can see that there are now a lot of libertarians who don't like national anthems, who associate them with nationalism, and who don't understand that the nationalism of the Enlightenment was not necessarily about racial divides, but it was about people governing themselves rather than being governed by large empires. Okay. So the liberation and unification of Italy was an immediate case in point. Okay, so Italy, you know, you might think, should Italy be separate or not? And right now we have a European Union that claims that it would be better for it not to be separate. But there's this, you know, the tides of history go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So Do you want to be part of the Holy Roman Empire? Really? Do you want to be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire? Really? Or wouldn't you rather each country govern itself, each state govern itself? And that is not an anti-libertarian idea, by the way. Okay, so why not a resurgence, the Jews in their own language? Of course, the Jews were not really a nation. Or were they? The issue was debated. And as far as the Jewish language, what was it? Yiddish, a German dialect that the Jewish masses of Eastern Europe spoke in their daily life? Or was it Hebrew, the language of ancient Israel, which they studied in their traditional schools and read from their prayer books? There were beginnings either way. The more visionary among the enlightened Jews chose Hebrew, sensing that it connected them to a dignified past in contrast to their humiliating present. Many books and periodicals were published in Hebrew in the 19th century, conveying to their readers the ideas of the Enlightenment and offering translations from world literature. It must be remembered that enlightenment in any language was rebellion against the established Jewish religion. In religious circles, the Hebrew literature of the Enlightenment was forbidden. Well, actually, I think the Enlightenment was a rebellion against traditional religion of any sort. So, many books and periodicals, okay, in religious circles, the Hebrew literature of the Enlightenment was forbidden. It was kept hidden and read in secret. Yet, the demand for this literature never ceased. Okay. The Jewish Enlightenment sought to improve the lot and raise the stature of Jews in general. The idea of achieving this in Palestine was one of the trends, even though it was not the major trend. In practical terms, it assumed two major forms, that of Jewish philanthropists from Europe investing in Jewish activities in Palestine, and that of the Jews of Palestine banding together to help themselves. The idea of dominance and of autonomy, if not independence, was not far below the surface. Moses Montefiore, a Jewish magnate and philanthropist of Britain, attempted to negotiate a charter for a Jewish buffer state between Egypt and Syria as early as 1839. This bid failed when the war between Egypt and Turkey was resolved in favor of the latter. At the beginning of the 19th century, the Jewish population of Palestine was concentrated in ghettos in 4 cities and was largely dependent on foreign charity. In the second half of the century, a movement out of the ghettos was begun. The first new suburb, Yamin Moshe, was founded outside the walls of Jerusalem in 1861. Others followed. More significant was the founding of schools intended to prepare Jewish children in Palestine for productive life. The first of these was founded in 1854. It was largely boycotted by the Orthodox Jewish community. More significant was the founding in 1870 of the Agricultural School of Mikveh Israel, intended to steer the Jewish community towards recapturing the cultivation of the land. Then there were actual beginnings of agricultural settlements. Motzah, outside Jerusalem, was first settled in 1873, and Petach Tikva, on the coastal plain, in 1878. These early attempts at resettlement were the work of the Palestinian Jewish community. The settlers came from no further away than Jerusalem. Petach Tikva is often credited with being the first colony and is fondly referred to as Mother of the Colonies. The colony was soon abandoned, but the idea whose time has come continued to present itself. In the years 1877 to 1878, there was a war between Russia and Turkey. The Russians came to the rescue of their ethnic cousins, the Bulgars, who rebelled against Turkish rule. A young Russian Jew studying in Paris, Eliezer Perelman, was struck by an idea. If the Bulgars can be sovereign in their historic domain, why not the Jews in theirs? When Perelman confided this radical idea to a friend, his friend pointed out that as much had been said recently in an English novel. I'll give you a few seconds to try to remember. Which English novel predicted Zionism? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Mary Ann Evans, writing under the pen name George Eliot, expressed it in her 4-part novel, Daniel Deronda, which was published in 1876. The support from this unexpected quarter strengthened Perelman's newly found conviction. And I'll tell you something, during the couple of years right before my father died, he spent a lot of time reading Daniel Deronda. Okay. Perelman used the pen name Ben Yehuda when he published his own first Zionist article, A Weighty Question, She'ela Nichbada, in Hebrew in 1879, more than 15 years before Herzl. This article is credited as the beginning of the Love of Zion, Chavat Zion movement, the precursor of modern Zionism. In 1881, Perelman migrated to Palestine and officially changed his name to Ben Yehuda. He is remembered under this name as father of the modern Hebrew language, which you can read more about in section 4. Another Russian Jew, Israel Belkind, founded the Zionist Association Bilu in Kharkov in January 1882. The purpose of the association was the resettlement of Palestine. Their efforts were not limited to hot air and printed paper. In July of 1882, Belkind, then 21 years of age, arrived in Jaffa at the head of a Bilu contingent. Petach Tikva was resettled in 1884. The same year saw the founding of 5 additional colonies. And by colonies, we mean moshavot. Rishon LeZion, Nes Ziona, Zichron Yaakov, Rosh Pina, Gedera, and Be'er Tuvia. Be'er Tuvia was added in 1887. Belkind himself settled in Gedera. We will quote from his legacy in chapter 3. The persons mentioned here by name are only a sampling. Numerous others thought out and acted out the saga. How, one may ask, did the veteran Zionists accept an ignorant newcomer like Herzl? Obviously, there was resistance. Abraham Edelson's reaction when he received the invitation to Herzl's first Zionist Congress in 1897 was to ignore it. Hey, does that remind you of certain libertarians we know? If you're not libertarian enough, if you just joined the Libertarian Party, are we going to ignore you because we were here first? Okay. His first thought, he later confided to his younger associate, Shlomo Gepstein, was, what could this German doctor possibly teach me about Zionism? Edelson had been active in the Zionist cause in Moscow throughout the 1890s. His fundamental lectures before pre-Zionist and Zionist groups laid the foundation of Zionist doctrine. Edelson eventually relented and attended the Congress in Basel, Switzerland. He subsequently became a strong supporter of Herzl. Zionist activity in Russia, which was faltering, experienced an upsurge. Herzl's contribution, Edelson explained to Gepstein, was oversimplification. Hey, if you think that oversimplifying something is always a bad thing, think again. Sometimes when we oversimplify something, it's easier to sell it to others. Okay. He, Edelson, analyzed the problems facing Zionism in depth. The analysis was of necessity complex. It was difficult to get it across and translate it into action. The troops on the ground needed a simple, motivating vision to keep them going. Herzl's broad-stroke political pretensions provided the simplified formula that Zionism required. When he founded the political arm of Zionism in 1896, Herzl was surprised to learn that he had a constituency on the ground in Palestine. Herzl failed to grasp the importance of this concrete beginning. He considered the Palestinian community too small and its rate of growth insignificant. At that rate, he calculated it would take forever to move the Jews of Europe or of the world to perfect segregation in Palestine. His own plan was to obtain a charter from the powers that be, then move the Jews en masse. He spent the remaining years of his life lobbying the rulers of the world. The court of the Turkish Sultan, whose domain included Palestine, was the focus of his activities. Okay. Herzl counseled his followers to stay put and wait for the charter. Wisely, his advice was disregard it. When he died in 1904 with no charter in sight, the settlement in Palestine was 20 or 30,000 strong. The Palestinian community mourned Herzl in state as its ghost president. Premature as Herzl's political actions were, the institutions he created proved vital in later years. The Zionist congresses served as a precursor to a legislature. The executive branch of the Zionist organization, later to be named the Jewish Agency, became a shadow government for the yet unborn modern Israel. It did not hurt to have the institutions of state ahead of the time they were needed. Later, when the Zionist movement did have a bargaining position, these institutions represented it. When it came time for the Zionist community in Palestine to assert itself by physical force, these institutions led it. Ultimately, the Palestinian Zionist community transitioned to self-government without missing a step. It had been self-governing for a long time previously. For the moment, Herzl's high-level approach was ineffective. The flaw in Herzl's policies lay in his failure to understand that foreign relations must reflect reality. Political moves must be backed up by physical facts and capabilities. Nobody would ratify a charter for a state unless the physical fabric of that state already existed. That's really kind of why we don't need governments, because we have governments before we make them official. And that's something to think about. Even before ascending to the presidency in 1924, Weizmann was able to obtain the charter that eluded Herzl. It took the form of the Balfour Declaration of 1917 and the League of Nations Mandate of 1922. Whatever credit is due to Weizmann for his social skills and statesmanship, the crucial credit must be placed where Weizmann himself placed it, in the Zionist community of Palestine, now at 80,000. Weizmann and the other practical Zionists understood that the charter was merely a milestone. It was not the end of the struggle, just as it could not have been the beginning. The founding of a nation had to continue acre by acre and year by year. And I'm going to stop here. So if you found that interesting, if you want to know more about Zionism and the two halves of the nation, you might want to buy this book, Israel, the Two Halves of the Nation. And I will continue to read here from it from time to time. And Julia and I are going to talk about this on Friday at 1 p.m. Central Time rather than Thursday the way we said we would. So stay tuned and you'll learn more about the story. And someday I might put these things together because, you know, Louisiana, Palestine, salt smugglers, all of these things must be related because we're closer together than ever suspected, for all things on earth are interconnected. So for now, goodbye.